In the winter of 1890, a young law clerk in the town of Saint-Quentin, in the north of France, woke before dawn with a pain in his side that would not relent, and by evening he was on a table being opened up for appendicitis, and by the following week he was confined to bed with nothing to do but heal and wait and look at the ceiling of his mother's house. She brought him a box of paints, not because he had asked for them, not because he had shown any prior interest in making pictures, but because she thought he might need something to occupy his hands during the long moratorium of recovery. He was 20 years old. His name was Henri Matisse, and he had been studying law because that was what one did, and he had been copying legal documents in an office because that was what one did after studying law, and he had never painted anything, and he had no particular reason to believe he ever would. But his mother brought him the box, and he opened it, and he began. What he felt in those first days, alone in that room with a brush in his hand, was something he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and failing and trying again. He called it a kind of paradise. He said it was like being shown a new world, or perhaps like discovering that the world he had been living in was not the only one. He was not particularly good at it, not at first. He had no training, no eye for composition, no sense of how to mix color or how to make a hand look like a hand. But none of that mattered, because what he had found was not skill, but permission. Permission to look, to sit still, to transform the act of seeing into the act of making. He painted small studies of objects on a table, a book, a glass. He painted slowly, without any hurry, without any audience, and the hours passed differently than they had before. When he recovered, he returned to the law office. He returned to the documents and the desk and the small predictable shape of the life that had been waiting for him. But something had changed. He had tasted the other thing, the thing that had no name yet but which felt more real than anything he had done in a courtroom or a library. He kept painting in secret, in the early mornings and late evenings, stealing hours from the edges of his days. He did not tell anyone what he was doing. He did not know yet if it was anything worth telling. He had been born on the last day of December 1869 in the town of Le Cateau-Cambresis, a small place in the north of France, not far from the Belgian border, a region of textile mills and grain fields and low gray skies. His father sold seeds and hardware. His mother painted porcelain in a ceramics factory, decorative plates and vases, small repetitive patterns that she rendered with care and speed. There was no art in the house, no books about painting, no sense that such a life was possible for someone from a family like theirs. The world Henri grew up in was industrious, practical, concerned with the making of useful things. Beauty, when it appeared, was a byproduct, not a goal. He was a quiet child, studious and obedient, the kind of boy who did what was expected of him, and did it well. He attended school in Saint-Quentin, where his family moved when he was young, and he was good at his studies, good enough that his father believed he could make something of himself in law. And so Henri studied law in Paris, and he passed his exams, and he returned to Saint-Quentin to begin his career. It was a reasonable life, a respectable life, and there was no reason to think it would be anything other than what it appeared to be. But the paint box had arrived, and the door had opened, and now he could not close it. By 1891, he had made a decision that must have seemed, to everyone who knew him, incomprehensible. He told his father he was leaving the law. He told him he was going to Paris to study painting. His father, who had built a life on seeds and hardware and the steady accumulation of modest security, was furious. He could not understand why his son would abandon a profession, a future, for something as uncertain and impractical as art. But Henri went anyway. He was 21 years old, and he had no talent to speak of, no connections, no money of his own, and no reason to believe he would succeed. He only knew that he could not go back to the documents and the desk, that the thing he had found in his mother's house was the only thing that mattered now. He arrived in Paris and enrolled at the Académie Julian, a private art school where students paid for the privilege of copying plaster casts and drawing from live models under the supervision of established painters. It was a factory of traditional training, a place where young men and women learned the grammar of academic art, proportion, anatomy, perspective, the smooth finish, the legible subject. Henri was older than most of the other students, and he was behind them in skill. His drawings were stiff, his colors muddy, his compositions awkward. He worked with a kind of grim determination, as though he were still copying legal documents, as though effort alone could compensate for the years he had lost. After a year at the Académie Julian, he gained admission to the École des Beaux-Arts, the most prestigious art school in France, and there he entered the studio of Gustave Moreau, a painter of mythological and biblical scenes, a man known for his dense, jewel-like canvases and his eccentric, almost mystical approach to teaching. Moreau was not interested in rules. He did not believe in forcing his students into a single style or method. He told them to look at everything, to go to the Louvre, to study the old masters and the new ones, to find their own vision. He said, "I am the bridge you will cross, and then you will forget me." Under Moreau's guidance, Henri began to see that painting was not about replicating the world, but about finding a language for what the world made him feel. He spent hours in the Louvre, copying works by Poussin, Chardin, and the Dutch still-life painters. He was drawn to the way Chardin could make a loaf of bread or a copper pot feel monumental, the way a simple arrangement of objects could carry the weight of attention, of care. He copied these paintings not to learn how to paint like Chardin, but to learn how Chardin had looked, what he had thought a painting could be. But it was the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who began to change the way Henri saw color. He visited exhibitions, he looked at Monet and Pissarro, at the way they had broken light into strokes of pure pigment, the way they had made the act of seeing visible on the canvas. He saw the work of Cézanne, and something shifted. Cézanne painted as though he were building the world from scratch, as though every apple and every mountain had to be constructed, piece by piece, out of color and form. There was no illusion in Cézanne, no trickery. The painting was the thing itself, not a window onto something else. Henri was still struggling. His work was tentative, uncertain, caught between the academic training that had taught him to render things accurately and the new ideas that were beginning to suggest there might be another way. He painted landscapes and still lifes, and they were competent, sometimes more than competent, but they did not yet have a voice. He did not yet have a voice. He did not yet know what he was trying to say. In 1894, his daughter Marguerite was born. Her mother was Caroline Yoblot, a model Henri had met in Paris. They did not marry, and Caroline and Marguerite did not live with him, but he supported them as best he could, which was not well. He had almost no money. He was 24 years old, living in a small studio, painting work that no one wanted to buy, and he was a father. The tension between the life he had chosen and the life that was required of him was already taking shape. 2 years later he married Amélie Parayer, a woman from Toulouse, a woman of intelligence and resolve who believed in him when there was almost no reason to believe. They married in 1898, and she brought Marguerite into their household, and they began a life together that would be defined by Henri's work, by the absolute primacy of his work, and by Amélie's willingness to organize everything else around it. She managed the household, she managed the money, she posed for him, she defended him against critics and dealers and family members who thought he was wasting his life. She made it possible for him to paint. They moved to a small apartment in Paris, and Henri set up a studio, and he kept working, kept searching. He was painting more boldly now, using brighter colors, looser brushwork. He was looking at the work of the Neo-Impressionists, at Seurat and Signac, at their theories of color and their belief that painting could be a science as well as an art. He experimented with their techniques, breaking his colors into small dots and strokes, trying to make light vibrate on the canvas. But it felt too rigid, too systematic. He wanted something freer, something that did not rely on theory, but on instinct. In the summer of 1896, Henri visited Brittany, and the light there, the clear coastal light, began to open something in him. He painted the sea and the cliffs and the small villages, and his colors grew brighter, more saturated. He was beginning to trust color, to let it do more of the work. He was beginning to understand that color was not just a way of describing things, but a way of feeling them, a way of translating sensation into paint. He read Signac's book on color theory. He studied the way complementary colors could intensify each other, the way red and green, blue and orange could create a kind of visual hum when placed side by side. He began to think of color as something independent of the object it was describing. A tree did not have to be green. A face did not have to be the color of flesh. Color could be whatever the painting needed it to be. In 1900, he and Amélie spent the summer in the south of France, and the Mediterranean light was a revelation. It was not the soft, diffused light of the north, not the gray and muted tones he had grown up with. It was harsh, bright, almost blinding, and it flattened everything it touched. Shadows were sharp and dark, and colors seemed to burn. Henri painted the landscape around them, and he painted Amélie, and he began to use color in a way that had nothing to do with realism. He painted her face in planes of green and violet, her dress in broad strokes of orange and red. He was not trying to make her look like herself. He was trying to make the painting feel like what it was like to see her in that light, in that heat, in that particular moment of attention. This was the beginning of something. He did not know yet what to call it, but he could feel it gathering, the sense that he was moving toward a way of working that was entirely his own. He was 30 years old, and he had been painting for a decade, and he was finally beginning to understand what painting could be for him. In 1905, Henri exhibited a group of paintings at the Salon d'Automne in Paris, in a room alongside works by André Derain, Maurice de Vlaminck, and several other young painters who were working in a similarly bold, color-saturated style. The critics were shocked. They called the room a cage of wild beasts, Les Fauves, and the name stuck. The paintings were violent, unnatural, barbaric. The colors were too bright, unfinished. It was an affront to good taste, to everything painting was supposed to be. But Henri did not care what the critics called it. He had found what he was looking for. He had found a way to paint that was not about copying the world, but about responding to it, about letting color and form carry the feeling of a thing, rather than its appearance. He painted portraits and still lifes and interiors, and he painted them with a freedom that felt, to him, like the paradise he had first encountered in his mother's house. He was not interested in realism. He was interested in the emotional truth of color, the way a patch of red could make you feel something you could not name. One of the paintings in that 1895 salon was called Woman with a Hat. It was a portrait of Amélie, seated, wearing an enormous, elaborate hat piled with flowers and ribbons and feathers. Her face was rendered in strokes of green and yellow and pink, her dress in slashes of orange and blue, the background a cacophony of unmodulated color. It was chaotic, joyful, almost violent in its refusal to behave. The critics hated it. The public laughed at it. But it was bought by two American expatriates, Leo and Gertrude Stein, who were just beginning to collect the new art, and that purchase changed Henri's life. It gave him a foothold, a believer, a small assurance that someone, somewhere, understood what he was trying to do. The Steins became his patrons and friends. He visited their apartment on the Rue de Fleurus, where they held salons and displayed their growing collection of radical art. It was there in that apartment that Henri first met Pablo Picasso, a young Spanish painter who was also being collected by the Steins, whose work was as different from Henri's as work could be. Picasso was a draftsman, obsessed with form and structure and the dismantling of the figure. Henri was a colorist, obsessed with light and surface and the creation of harmony. They were the same age, both 35, both ambitious, both convinced of their own vision. They looked at each other's work with a mixture of fascination and suspicion. They would spend the next 50 years in dialogue, a long conversation that was part friendship, part rivalry, part mutual surveillance. But in 1905, Henri was not thinking about Picasso. He was thinking about color, about how far he could push it. about what would happen if he stripped away everything else: narrative, depth, detail, and let color and form do all the work. He was thinking about a painting he had not yet made, a painting that was gathering in his mind like a storm, a painting of figures in a landscape, moving, dancing, holding hands in a circle. He did not know yet what it would look like, but he could feel it there waiting. He kept working. He painted more portraits, more still lifes, more interiors. He painted his studio, the window open to the street below, the light pouring in, the world outside rendered in flat blocks of color. He was obsessed with windows. He painted them again and again, the frame within the frame, the boundary between inside and outside, between the private space of the studio and the public space of the world. The window was a threshold, a place where two kinds of light met, and he wanted to paint that meeting without losing either side. In 1906, he traveled to Algeria, to the city of Biskra, and the North African light and color and pattern overwhelmed him. He saw the tile work, the textiles, the intricate geometric designs that covered every surface, and he understood that decoration was not a lesser form of art. It was its own kind of intelligence, its own way of organizing beauty. He bought fabrics and rugs and brought them back to Paris, and he began to incorporate them into his paintings, draping them over tables and chairs and walls, letting their patterns compete with the painted surface, creating a space where everything was flat, everything was ornament, everything was color. He was moving toward something. He could feel it. He was stripping away the unnecessary, learning how to simplify without losing intensity. He painted a series of small studies, figures in landscapes, trying to find the simplest possible way to render a body, a gesture, a sense of movement. He was not interested in anatomy or proportion. He was interested in rhythm, in the way a line could move through space, the way a curve could echo another curve, the way a group of figures could create a shape that was more important than any individual figure. In 1909, he received a commission that would define his career. A Russian textile merchant and collector named Sergei Shuchin, who had been buying Henri's work for several years, asked him to create 2 large decorative panels for the staircase of his mansion in Moscow. Shuchin wanted something grand, something that would transform the space, something that would be unlike anything else in his collection. Henri agreed, though he did not yet know what he would paint. He spent months thinking about it, making studies, trying out compositions. He knew he wanted to paint figures, and he knew he wanted them to be in motion, to be engaged in some kind of collective activity. He thought about music, about dance, about the way bodies move together in rhythm. He thought about the ancient world, about Greek vases and their simplified, silhouetted figures, the way they captured movement with just a few lines. He thought about the paintings he had seen in museums, the bacchanals and pastorals, and he thought about how he could take that tradition and make it new, make it his own, make it pure. By 1910, he had settled on 2 subjects, dance and music. They would be companion pieces, each depicting 5 figures engaged in a primal, timeless activity. No setting, no context, no narrative. Just the figures, the activity, and the colors that would hold them. He began with dance. He painted it on a canvas almost 13 feet wide and over 8 feet tall, a monumental scale that required him to work differently, to think about the painting as something that would surround the viewer, that would create an environment rather than just an image. He painted it quickly, with a directness that left no room for hesitation. 5 nude figures, their bodies rendered in a flat, rust-red, almost terracotta color, are joined in a circle, hands clasped, moving in a rhythm that is both frenzied and controlled. Their bodies are simplified to the point of abstraction, all curves and elongation, no detail, no individuality. They are not portraits, they are bodies in motion, bodies as pure form. The background is divided into 2 fields of color, a deep, vibrant blue for the sky, and a bright, saturated green for the ground. That is all. No shading, no modeling, no sense of depth or space. The blue and green are as flat as the figures, and they press forward with the same intensity, so that the painting becomes a single, unified surface, a field of color and shape, where nothing recedes, where everything exists in the same visual plane. The figures move clockwise, their bodies leaning into the motion, their limbs stretched and taut. One figure, on the right, has released the hand of the figure beside her, and her arm swings free, a moment of rupture in the circle, a break in the rhythm that makes the whole composition feel alive, precarious, as though the dance could collapse at any moment or surge forward into something even more intense. The painting vibrates with energy, with a kind of savage joy, and yet it is also perfectly controlled, every line and curve and block of color placed exactly where it needs to be. When dance was exhibited in Paris in the autumn of 1910, before it was sent to Moscow, the reaction was swift and hostile. The critics found it crude, primitive, ugly. They said it looked unfinished, that the figures were grotesque, that the colors were garish. They said it was an insult to the tradition of painting, a regression to some prehistoric state of art-making. They did not understand that this was precisely what Henri was trying to do, to strip away the layers of convention and technique and arrive at something elemental, something that felt like the first painting ever made, a painting that existed outside of time, outside of culture, pure and direct and unapologetic. Shukin saw the painting in Paris, and he hesitated. He had expected something decorative, something beautiful in a conventional sense. And dance was neither of those things. It was powerful, unsettling, almost barbaric. He left Paris without committing, and Henri did not know if the commission would hold. But Shukin went home to Moscow, and he thought about the painting, and he thought about what it would mean to live with it, and he decided that he wanted it after all. He sent word to Henri. He would take dance, and he would take music as well. Henri completed Music, a companion piece depicting 5 figures seated on a green hillside against a blue sky, each holding or playing an instrument, or simply listening. It is quieter than dance, more contemplative, but it shares the same radical simplification, the same refusal of depth and detail, the same insistence that color and form are enough. The 2 paintings were shipped to Moscow, where they were installed in the staircase of Shukin's mansion, visible to anyone who entered the house. They transformed the space. They made the staircase feel like a threshold to another world, a world of color and rhythm and pure sensation. For Henri, they were proof that his vision could exist at scale, that the principles he had been working out in small canvases could be expanded, could be made monumental without losing their intensity. But the creation of dance and music had not been easy. Henri had worked on them with a ferocity that exhausted him. He had repainted sections, scraped down surfaces, started over. He had lived with the canvases for months, staring at them, adjusting a line here, a color there, trying to make them feel inevitable, as though they had always existed. The ease and joy that the paintings seemed to express were the result of grinding, obsessive labor, and this was the central paradox of Henri's life. He was the painter of pleasure, of light, of the open window, and the languid afternoon. And he achieved this by working harder than almost anyone, by destroying as many canvases as he kept, by refusing to accept anything less than the exact feeling he was chasing. Amélie understood this. She had always understood it. She had organized their lives around his work, had posed for him for hours, had managed the money and the household and the children, Marguerite and now their 2 sons, Jean and Pierre, so that Henri could paint without distraction. She believed in him with a faith that was almost absolute, and she paid for that faith with her own autonomy, her own ambitions, if she had any, which history has mostly forgotten to record. After dance and music, Henri was no longer an outsider. He was recognized, collected, written about, but recognition did not make the work easier. If anything, it made it harder. He was expected to produce, to maintain the vision, to keep surprising people. And he was getting older. He was 41 when dance was completed, and he was beginning to feel the weight of time, the sense that he had not yet done everything he needed to do. He moved his family to the south of France, to the city of Nice, in 1917, ostensibly to escape the cold Parisian winters, but really because he needed the light. The Mediterranean light was what he had been chasing since his first trip south, and now he wanted to live inside it, to let it fill his studio and his canvases and his days. They rented an apartment in a hotel overlooking the sea, and Henri set up a studio, and he began to paint the interiors of his rooms. The windows, the light pouring in, the world outside reduced to patches of blue and green. He painted Amalie Lesnau. He hired models, young women who came to the studio and posed for him in costumes and drapes and states of undress. He painted them as odalisques, reclining figures in harem pants and turbans, surrounded by patterned textiles and decorative objects. The paintings were lush, sensual, almost decadent, and they were criticized for being escapist, for ignoring the suffering of the world outside the studio. Europe was still recovering from the First World War, and Henri was painting women lounging on divans, surrounded by luxury. It seemed, to some, like a retreat, a refusal to engage with history, with reality. But Henri did not see it that way. He believed that the creation of beauty, the creation of spaces where the eye could rest and the mind could find peace, was its own form of serious work. He said that he wanted his paintings to be like a comfortable armchair, a place where a weary person could sit and recover. He did not mean this dismissively. He meant that the world was full of noise and chaos and suffering, and that painting could offer something else, something necessary, a moment of calm, a space where color and form could create their own kind of order, their own kind of joy. The odalisques were not portraits, they were formal problems. He was interested in the way a body could be arranged in space, the way a curve could echo the curve of a cushion or a drape, the way a figure could become part of the overall pattern of the painting, no more or less important than the wallpaper behind her or the rug beneath her. He was not interested in the psychology of his models, in who they were or what they thought. He was interested in the shapes they made, the way light fell on their skin, the way their presence could organize the space around them. He painted the same models again and again in the same poses, in the same costumes, and the paintings were variations on a theme, each one slightly different, each one testing a new arrangement of color or form. He worked slowly, methodically, adjusting and readjusting, sometimes spending months on a single canvas. He destroyed many of them. He painted over them, scraped them down, started again. The ease of the final images was the result of countless hours of labor, of trying and failing and trying again. He was still in dialogue with Picasso, though they rarely saw each other now. Picasso was in Paris, moving through his different periods, blue, rose, cubist, neoclassical, reinventing himself every few years, restless, prolific, always destroying and rebuilding. Henri stayed in Nice, working more slowly, more carefully, refining his vision rather than revolutionizing it. The critics framed them as opposites: Picasso the radical, the destroyer, the man who dismantled the figure and rebuilt it in pieces; Henri the conservative, the decorator, the man who made pretty pictures of pretty women. But Henri did not see himself that way. He believed that his work was as radical as Picasso's, just in a different direction. Picasso broke things apart. Henri put things together. Both were necessary. In 1930, the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia commissioned Henri to create a mural for the main gallery of their new building. It was another monumental project, another chance to work at scale, and Henri accepted. He was 60 years old, and he was tired, but he could not refuse. The mural would be installed above 3 arched windows, a space over 40 feet wide and 12 feet tall, and it would depict a dance, a return to the theme he had explored 2 decades earlier, with Dance for Chacun. He called the new work The Dance, the same title, but this time the figures were even more simplified, even more abstract. They were no longer rust red against blue and green. They were rendered in shades of pink and blue and gray, and they moved through the space like music, like a visual rhythm that had no beginning and no end. He worked on the mural for 3 years, making study after study, adjusting the composition, the colors, the placement of the figures. He built a full-scale mock-up in his studio, pinning paper to the walls, standing on a ladder with a long pole tipped with charcoal, drawing the figures from a distance so he could see the whole composition at once. When the mural was finally installed, there was a problem. Henri had been given the wrong measurements. The arches in the gallery were not the size he had been told, and the mural did not fit. He had to start over. He had to repaint the entire thing, adjusting the composition to the correct dimensions, and he did it without complaint, without drama. He simply began again. It took another year. By the time the second version was complete, he had spent 4 years on a single project, and he was exhausted physically and mentally, but the mural was beautiful. It was among his greatest works, a testament to his ability to think in terms of space and architecture, to create paintings that were not just images but environments. Back in Nice, he continued painting the interiors, the odalisques, the windows. But his body was beginning to fail him. He had been diagnosed with cancer, and he had undergone surgery, and the surgery had left him weak, in pain, often confined to a wheelchair or a bed. He could no longer stand at an easel for long periods. He could no longer move through his studio with the ease he once had. He was in his 70s, and his body was betraying him, and yet he could not stop working. The work was the only thing that mattered. It was the only thing that had ever mattered. In 1941, unable to paint in the way he once had, Henri began to experiment with a new technique. He called it painting with scissors. He had assistants prepare large sheets of paper, painted in solid colors, bright blues, greens, yellows, reds, oranges, pinks. He would sit in bed or in his wheelchair, and he would take a pair of scissors, and he would cut shapes from the paper, organic, flowing shapes, leaves and birds and stars and bodies, and he would arrange them on a white background, pinning them up, moving them around, adjusting their positions until they felt right. Then the assistants would glue them down and the composition would be fixed, and he would start another. The cutouts, as they came to be called, were unlike anything he had done before. They were not paintings, not drawings, not quite collages in the traditional sense. They were something new, a form that existed between media, that used color and shape in their purest form, without the mediation of a brush or a pencil. The shapes were simple, bold, joyful, and they moved across the white backgrounds with a freedom that felt almost childlike, as though Henri had returned to the beginning, to the first impulse to make something beautiful. He began to make larger and larger cutouts, compositions that covered entire walls, that transformed the rooms they were in. He made a series called Jazz, a portfolio of 20 prints based on his cutouts, accompanied by his own handwritten text, reflections on color and form and the act of creation. The images were exuberant, almost reckless acrobats and dancers and swimmers and abstract shapes that seemed to pulse with life. The colors were saturated, electric, impossible to ignore. The series was published in 1947, and it announced to the world that Henri, now in his late 70s, bedridden and in pain, was still making work that felt more alive than almost anything being produced by younger artists. The critics who had dismissed him as a decorator, as a painter of escapist fantasies, had to reconsider. The cutouts were radical. They were a complete rethinking of what a work of art could be. They were not about illusion or depth or narrative. They were about color and shape and the pure joy of arranging forms in space. They were about creation as an act of defiance, as a way of insisting that beauty could still be made, even in a world that had been torn apart by war, even in a body that was failing. One of Henri's last and greatest projects was the Chapel of the Rosary in the town of Vence, not far from Nice. A Dominican nun who had once been his nurse asked him to help design a chapel for her convent, and Henri, who was not religious, who had never professed any faith, agreed. He spent 4 years on the project, designing every element, the stained glass windows, the tile murals, the vestments, the altar, the crucifix. He wanted the chapel to be a total work of art, a space where everything was in harmony, where light and color and form came together to create a sense of peace, of transcendence, even for those who did not believe. The windows were made of cut-out shapes in blue, green, and yellow, and the light that came through them bathed a white interior in a shifting, luminous glow. The murals were simple black-line drawings on white tiles depicting Saint Dominic and the Virgin and Child, rendered with the same economy and grace as his late cutouts. The chapel was consecrated in 1951, and Henri said it was the culmination of his life's work, the place where everything he had learned about color and line and space came together. He was 81 years old when the chapel was completed, and he was dying. His body was failing in ways that could no longer be managed or ignored. He spent most of his time in bed, surrounded by his assistants, still working, still cutting shapes from paper, still arranging them, still trying to find the exact configuration that would make the image sing. He worked until he could not work anymore, until his hands could no longer hold the scissors, until the pain became too much. He died on November 3, 1954. In Nice, at the age of 84. He had been making art for more than 60 years, and in that time he had transformed what painting could be, what color could do, what simplicity could express. He had started as a law clerk who stumbled into painting by accident, and he had become one of the foundational figures of modern art, a man whose vision was so complete, so fully realized, that it seemed as though he had been born knowing exactly what he wanted to say. But the truth was more complicated. He had spent his entire life searching, struggling, failing, starting over. The ease and joy of his paintings were not natural. They were achieved through relentless effort, through a discipline that was almost punishing. He destroyed more work than he kept. He repainted canvases until they were right, or until he gave up and began again. He was never satisfied, never certain. He was driven by a need to make something that felt true, that felt necessary, and that need never left him, not even at the end. After his death, the work continued to live, continued to find new audiences, new meanings. The cutouts, which had been seen by some as a late curiosity, a charming but minor coda to his career, came to be recognized as some of the most radical works of the 20th century. They influenced generations of artists, from the abstract expressionists to the minimalists to the contemporary painters and sculptors who continue to grapple with questions of color and form and abstraction. The chapel at Vence became a pilgrimage site, a place where people came to sit in the light and feel the presence of something larger than themselves, even if they could not name it. The odalisques, which had been criticized as escapist, as politically naive, were re-examined and recontextualized. Scholars debated their relationship to colonialism, to the male gaze, to the tradition of Orientalism in European art. Some defended them as formal explorations, as paintings that were about color and composition, rather than the bodies they depicted. Others saw them as complicit in a history of objectification and appropriation. The debate continues, and it is unlikely to be resolved, because Henri's work, like all great work, is capacious enough to contain contradictions, to mean different things to different people at different times. His relationship with Picasso became the stuff of legend. The two men, so different in temperament and approach, so equally convinced of their own genius, circled each other for decades, each trying to outdo the other, each learning from the other, each refusing to concede supremacy. They visited each other's studios. They traded paintings. They sent messages through mutual friends. When Henri died, Picasso was devastated. He said that he and Henri had been married, that they had shared a life together, even though they had spent most of it apart. He said that he no longer had anyone to talk to, no one who understood what he was trying to do. He kept several of Henri's paintings in his own collection, and he looked at them often, and he thought about what they meant, what they had cost to make. The myth of Henri Matisse, the myth that persists and shapes how we see his work, is the myth of the old man cutting shapes from paper, making joy out of limitation, finding his freest form when his body was most constrained. It is a beautiful myth, and it is true, but it is not the whole truth. The cutouts were not a sudden late flowering, not a miraculous burst of creativity in the face of death. They were the culmination of everything Henri had been working toward for 60 years. They were the final distillation of a vision that had been there from the beginning. In the law clerk's room in St. Quentin, in the first tentative brushstrokes on a canvas, in the moment when a young man who had no reason to believe he could be a painter picked up a brush and discovered that the world could be made new. Henri had always been interested in simplification, in stripping away the unnecessary, in finding the essential form and color of a thing. The cutouts were the logical endpoint of that process. They were painting reduced to its most basic elements, shape and color, and yet they contained everything, all the complexity and richness and joy that painting could offer. They were proof that less could be more, that economy could be generosity, that simplicity could be profound. But the cutouts were also the result of necessity, of the body's failure forcing a new way of working. If Henri had been able to stand at an easel, if he had been able to paint in the way he once had, he might never have picked up the scissors. He might have continued making the same kind of paintings he had been making for years, the interiors and the odalisques and the still lifes. The cutouts were born from loss, from the diminishment of the body, and they transformed that loss into something triumphant, something that felt like liberation. This is the paradox at the heart of Henri's life. The man who painted pleasure lived a life of discipline and renunciation. He sacrificed everything: time, money, relationships, comfort for the work. He asked the same of those around him. Amélie, who had organized her entire life around his needs, eventually grew exhausted. They separated in 1939, after more than 40 years of marriage, and though they never divorced, they lived apart for the rest of Henri's life. She had given him everything, and he had taken it, because the work required it, because he believed that the work was more important than anything else, including the people he loved. And perhaps he was right. Perhaps the work was worth the cost. The paintings and the cutouts and the chapel vents are still here, still radiating their particular light, still offering their particular gift, which is the gift of beauty, of joy, of a space where the world feels coherent and whole, even if only for a moment. Henri believes that this was enough, that this was what painting could do, and maybe it is, but there is something sad in it too, something that the work cannot quite erase. The sadness of a man who could not rest, who could not stop, who could not allow himself to simply be, the sadness of a life that was defined entirely by making, by the ceaseless effort to transform seeing into form, feeling into color, the sadness of a marriage that dissolved under the weight of that effort, of children who grew up in the shadow of their father's obsession, of a body that worked until it broke. Henri did not talk much about this sadness. He did not paint it. His work is almost uniformly joyful, luminous, affirming. He said that he wanted his paintings to be a refuge, a source of calm, and he achieved that. But the cost of creating that refuge was high, and it was borne not just by him, but by everyone around him. In his later years, bedridden and unable to move without assistance, Henri was surrounded by people assistants, models, visitors, friends, but he was also profoundly alone. He had dedicated his life to making images of connection, of harmony, of bodies moving together in rhythm, and yet his own life was defined by solitude, by the long hours in the studio, by the silence of the work. He had spent decades painting windows, those thresholds between interior and exterior, between the private space of the self and the public space of the world, and perhaps he had been painting his own condition all along, the condition of the artist who looks out at the world but remains always on the other side of the glass. He kept working, even when he could barely move, even when the pain was constant. He kept cutting shapes, kept arranging them, kept refining the compositions. The work was his anchor, the thing that gave his life structure and meaning, and he could not let it go. He would not let it go. Not until the body failed completely, not until there was no choice. After his death, the studio in Nice was emptied, the canvases and cutouts and papers and scissors packed away, or distributed to museums and collectors. The rooms that had been filled with color and light and the evidence of making were cleaned and repainted, and they became just rooms again, empty and silent. But the work remained. It traveled to museums around the world. It was reproduced in books and on posters. It became part of the visual language of the 20th century. People who had never heard Henri's name still recognized his colors, his shapes, his particular way of seeing. The legacy is vast, almost impossible to summarize. Henri's influence can be seen in abstract painting, in color fields painting, in the work of artists like Ellsworth Kelly and David Hockney and countless others who learned from his example that color could be a subject in itself, that simplification could be a form of intensity, that decoration was not a dirty word. His cutouts anticipated movements that would not fully emerge until after his death. Pop art, minimalism, post-painterly abstraction. He was ahead of his time and also perfectly of his time, a man who absorbed the lessons of the past and transformed them into something that felt both ancient and completely new. But perhaps the most important part of Henri's legacy is the permission he gave, the model he provided, for artists to follow their own vision, even when that vision was unfashionable, even when it was misunderstood, even when it was misunderstood. He was not a revolutionary in the way Picasso was, not a destroyer, not a breaker of rules. He was a builder, a maker of harmonies, and he showed that there was more than one way to be radical, more than one way to change the course of art. He showed that it was possible to dedicate a life to beauty, to the creation of spaces where the eye could rest and the mind could find peace, and that this was not a retreat from the world, but a form of engagement with it, a way of insisting that joy and pleasure and harmony were as real and as necessary as suffering and chaos and despair. He believed that painting could offer a moment of respite, a breath, a pause, and he made that belief into a body of work that continues to offer that gift, more than half a century after his death. The chapel at Vence still stands, still glows with the light that pours through the colored windows, still offers its quiet invitation to sit and look and feel. The cutouts still hang in museums, still pulse with life, still seem to move even though they are fixed, still make people smile, still remind us that making something beautiful is a way of resisting the world's tendency toward entropy and ugliness. The paintings of dancers and odalisques and interiors and windows still radiate their particular warmth, still invite us into spaces where color is enough, where the act of looking becomes its own kind of pleasure. Henri spent his life trying to capture a feeling, the feeling of being fully present, fully alive, fully immersed in the act of seeing. He wanted his paintings to make people feel the way he felt when he first picked up a brush in his mother's house, when the world opened up and showed him that there was another way to live, another way to be. He wanted to give that gift to others, and he did, again and again, in canvas after canvas, in cutout after cutout, until there was nothing left to give. And now the work is ours. It belongs to anyone who looks at it, who lets it work on them, who stands in front of a canvas or a cutout and feels something shift, something open, something ease. Henri is gone, but the vision remains, and it is as vivid and as urgent as it was when he first saw it, when he first understood what painting could be, when he first believed that the creation of beauty was worth a life. The story of Henri Matisse is not a story of genius descending fully formed from the heavens. It is a story of work, of discipline, of relentless effort, of failing and trying again, of spending 60 years learning how to see, how to feel, how to make. It is a story of sacrifice, of solitude, of the cost of devotion, and of the belief that the cost was worth it, that the work justified everything, that the paintings and the cutouts in the chapel were enough. Whether they were enough, whether any work of art can ever be enough to justify the life that made it, is a question that cannot be answered. It is a question each person must answer for themselves, standing in a museum or a chapel or a quiet room, looking at a canvas or a piece of colored paper, feeling whatever it is they feel, deciding whether the beauty is real, whether it matters, whether it is a refuge or an evasion, whether it offers something true or only a pleasant distraction. Henri believed it was true. He believed it with a certainty that never wavered, even when his body failed, even when the world did not understand, even when the cost became almost unbearable. He believed that color and form and light could transform the act of seeing into something transcendent, something that connected us to each other and to the world and to whatever lies beyond the world. He believed that painting was not a luxury but a necessity, not an escape but a form of presence, not a distraction but a way of paying attention to what was really there, beneath the surface of things, in the space between the eye and the canvas. And so he kept painting, kept arranging, kept refining, until the very end, until there was no more time, no more strength, no more possibility. He left behind a body of work that is vast and varied and endlessly rich, a body of work that continues to speak, continues to offer its particular vision, continues to insist that beauty is real, that joy is possible, that the world can be seen and felt and rendered in ways that make it new. He left behind rooms full of color, walls covered in cutouts, canvases that glow with light, a chapel that transforms stone and glass into something like prayer. He left behind a life that was consumed by making, by the ceaseless effort to see clearly and to translate that seeing into form. He left behind a question, the same question every artist leaves behind. Was it worth it? And the work, silent and radiant and enduring, offers its only possible answer. Look and decide for yourself. The last years in the apartment in Nice were years of withdrawal and concentration. The world outside was recovering from another war, rebuilding, moving forward, but Henri was moving inward, deeper into the work, deeper into the space between the scissors and the paper, between the eye and the shape. He had assistants who prepared the materials, who pinned the shapes to the walls, who helped him move from bed to chair and back again. But the vision was entirely his. No one else could see what he saw. No one else could arrange the shapes the way he did. No one else had spent a lifetime learning how to make color sing. The cutouts grew larger, more ambitious. He made a series called The Swimming Pool, a frieze of blue figures swimming through white space. Figures that were rendered with just a few cuts, just a few curves, but which captured the movement of the body through water with a precision and grace that felt miraculous. He made Soar of the King, a large composition of abstracted figures in red and yellow and green and black, a late self-portrait disguised as a pattern, a meditation on age and memory and the persistence of the creative impulse. He made the Snail, a spiral arrangement of colored squares that suggested the form of a snail without depicting it, a work of pure abstraction that still felt alive, still felt connected to the world. The room where he worked was covered in cutouts, pinned to the walls, overlapping and accumulating, a space that had become a total environment, a world made entirely of color and shape. Visitors who came to see him were overwhelmed. They said it felt like stepping into one of his paintings, like entering a space where the normal rules of seeing no longer applied, where everything was brighter, more vivid, more intense. Henri sat in the middle of it all, an old man in a wheelchair, holding a pair of scissors, still working, still trying to get it right. He did not talk much about his legacy, about what the work would mean after he was gone. He was too busy making it. But he knew that he had done something, that he had arrived at a way of working that was entirely his own, that felt like the culmination of everything he had been searching for. He knew that the cutouts were unlike anything anyone else was making, that they were a new language, a new way of thinking about color and form and space. He knew that they would outlast him, that they would continue to speak long after he was silent. And they have. The cutouts are everywhere now, reproduced endlessly, printed on posters and T-shirts and coffee mugs, a ubiquity that both celebrates and diminishes them, that makes them simultaneously more accessible and less visible. But the originals, when you stand in front of them, still have the power to stop you, to make you see differently, to remind you that color is not just a property of objects, but a force, a presence, a way of feeling the world. The dance that Henri painted for Shuchin in 1910 is still there, hanging in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where it has been since the Russian Revolution, when Shukin's collection was nationalized. It is still shocking, still alive, still capable of making you feel something primal and urgent and joyful. The figures still move in their endless circle, still hold hands and lean into the rhythm, still exist in that impossible space where there is no ground and no sky, only color, only motion, only the pure fact of being. The chapel at Vence is still there, still glowing, still offering its quiet gift to anyone who walks through the door. People come from all over the world to sit in that light, to look at those simple line drawings, to feel the way the space holds them, the way the colors shift and change as the day progresses, the way everything, the windows, the murals, the altar, the vestments, works together to create a sense of wholeness, of peace, of something larger than the individual elements. The odalisques are still there, still controversial, still prompting arguments about beauty and representation and power and pleasure. They are still lush and decorative and seductive, still insisting that the surface of things matters, that pattern and color and form are not superficial, but essential, that the world of appearances is not a lie, but a truth of its own. And the cutouts are everywhere, in museums and galleries and books and screens, still making people stop and look, still reminding us that simplicity is not easy, that economy is a form of generosity, that the most direct path between feeling and form is often the most difficult to find. Henri's life was a long arc from ignorance to mastery, from the law clerk who did not know what painting was, to the old man who could cut a shape from a piece of paper and make it feel inevitable, as though it had always existed, as though it had been waiting all along to be found. It was a life of work, of ceaseless, grinding, obsessive work, and of the belief that the work was worth it, that beauty was worth it, that the creation of spaces where people could rest and look and feel was worth the sacrifice of everything else. He gave his life to it, and he asked the people around him to give their lives to it too, and some did and some could not, and the cost was real, and it was high, and it cannot be undone. But the work is still here, still radiating its particular light, still offering its particular gift, and maybe that is enough, maybe it has to be enough. Henri Matisse died in 1954, an old man in a bed in Nice, surrounded by assistants and papers and scissors and the shapes he had been cutting just hours before. He died knowing that he had done what he set out to do, that he had found a way to paint that was entirely his own, that he had created a body of work that would endure. He died knowing that he had been seen, that his vision had been recognized, that he had taken his place among the artists he had studied and admired and tried to equal. But he also died alone, in the way that all people die alone, in the private space of the body's final failure, in the moment when the work stops, and the self dissolves, and there is nothing left but the silence. And in that silence the work remained, as it always does, separate from the life that made it, free to mean whatever it needs to mean, free to find new audiences and new contexts and new interpretations, free to continue speaking in a voice that is no longer the artist's but the work's own. The story of Henri Matisse is the story of a man who believed that painting could save him, and so he gave everything to it, and it did save him, in the only way that art can save anyone, by giving him a reason to keep going, a structure for his days, a purpose that felt larger than himself. Whether it saved anyone else is impossible to say. Whether the paintings and the cutouts in the chapel offer real solace, or only the illusion of solace, real beauty, or only a pleasing arrangement of colors and shapes, is a question that each person must answer alone, in the silence of their own looking. But the work is there, waiting, patient, enduring, as vivid now as it was when Henri first made it, as full of life, as full of the belief that color and form and light are enough, that the world can be made new, that the act of seeing can be transformed into the act of making, that beauty is not an escape, but a form of truth, hard-won and necessary and real. And so the story ends, not with a conclusion, but with a dissolving, a waiting, a letting go. The man is gone, the life is over, the work remains. Somewhere in the south of France, light is still pouring through colored windows, still bathing a white room in blue and yellow and green, still transforming stone into music. Somewhere in a museum, 5 figures are still dancing, still holding hands, still leaning into the rhythm. Somewhere a pair of scissors has just cut through a sheet of blue paper, and a shape has fallen onto a white surface, and for a moment the world is exactly as it should be, and everything is color, and everything is color, and everything is light, and everything is enough.